She hurt the only woman he would never leave defenseless. His mother's silence hid a pain deeper than the fracture in her arm, and it was in that silence that he orchestrated the most devastating justice she could ever face. If this story has piqued your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. We continue. London awoke under a sky of greyish hues that June morning, but for Richard Alistair, the day began like so many others over the past 20 years, with a call to his mother before even leaving home. It was a sacred, untouchable ritual. It didn't matter if he was about to embark on an international meeting or if he had just returned from an exhausting trip. Mrs. Helen's voice was the first sound he needed to hear to feel that the world was in its right place. Richard was not just a successful businessman, he was the embodiment of the British dream, a man who had built an empire from a small logistics company inherited from his father and transformed it into a conglomerate employing thousands of people. His businesses involved transport, technology, investments, and even social projects that carried his name to the four corners of the country. Business magazines vied for interviews with him, universities invited him to give lectures, politicians sought his opinion, and London's elite saw him as a rare example of integrity in a corporate world, often stained by scandals. But behind all that success there was a truth few knew. Richard Alistair would not have reached where he was without the silent and firm presence of his mother. Mrs. Helen had been a widow for 15 years, ever since her husband had passed away prematurely, leaving a legacy of principles and a growing company. It was she who held things together when her youngest son was still learning to run the business. It was she who advised him on the most difficult decisions, who prevented him from taking risky paths, who taught him that respect is earned with character, not with money. Mrs. Helen was never a woman who sought the limelight. She avoided social events, refused interviews, and preferred the discretion of her apartment in Belgravia to any high society party. But within that apparent simplicity there was a fortress. She was the kind of woman who did not bow to pressure, who did not change her mind for convenience, and who never allowed money to change the family's values. Richard respected her not only as a mother, but as the only person in the world whose opinion truly mattered. That's why, when he met Veronica Cross at a charity event 5 years ago, the first thing he did was introduce her to his mother. Veronica was everything society expected of a corporate first lady: elegant, articulate, involved in social causes, and with a smile that lit up any room. She ran a foundation dedicated to the education of underprivileged children and was always invited to participate in debates on social responsibility. The press adored her. Lifestyle magazines placed her on lists of inspiring women, and Richard, still single at 38, saw in her the ideal companion to share not only his personal life, but also the commitments that came with his name and position. Helen never said anything against Veronica, but Richard always felt that something was missing in his mother's approval. It wasn't explicit disapproval. It was something more subtle, a reservation, a silence that lasted a few seconds longer than it should when Veronica was mentioned. But he attributed it to his mother's naturally cautious temperament, to the difficulty any mother-in-law has in fully accepting the woman who shares her son's life. And he moved forward. They married in a grand ceremony at the Wentworth estate, with the presence of businessmen, politicians, and artists. It was a magazine cover story, a topic in social columns, an event that captivated London's elite. The first few years were balanced. Veronica integrated into Richard's routine, accompanied him on trips, participated in corporate dinners, and maintained her impeccable public image. But over time, something began to change. She started to question the influence Helen still had over company decisions. She suggested that his mother was getting older, and that perhaps it was time for her to step away completely from corporate matters. Richard listened, but did not pursue the conversations. For him, his mother was not just an emotional advisor. She still signed important documents, participated in strategic meetings, and had veto power over risky investments. It was a protection, not a burden. Veronica smiled, agreed, and changed the subject. But Richard began to notice small signs. Family lunches where Veronica made excuses not to go. Commitments that mysteriously coincided with visits he planned to make to his mother. Subtle comments about how Helen was becoming repetitive, tired, perhaps even a little confused. Richard paid no attention. He thought they were just the natural differences between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, those tensions that exist in any family, but which time and coexistence eventually soften. Until everything changed on a Tuesday in early May. Helen had been experiencing back pain and difficulty moving. Doctors recommended physiotherapy sessions at a renowned rehabilitation clinic in the West End of London, specializing in elderly patient care. It was a discreet place, with impeccable facilities and a highly qualified team. Richard personally chose the clinic, visited the facilities and spoke with the staff. He wanted the best for his mother. She began the sessions in April and, despite complaining a little about the routine, admitted that she was feeling better. Veronica offered to accompany her mother-in-law to some of the sessions. Richard thought it was a kind gesture, a sign that the relationship between the two was finally growing closer. Helen, always polite, accepted. But when Richard asked his mother how her day at the clinic had been, she answered briefly, quickly changing the subject. He found it strange but didn't press. He thought perhaps his mother was just tired or embarrassed about needing help with simple things. On Tuesday, May 7th, Richard was in an important meeting at the office when he received the call. It was from the clinic. The voice on the other end of the line was controlled but carried urgency. Helen had suffered a fall. She was being attended to on site, but it would be necessary to take her to the hospital for examinations. Her right arm appeared to be fractured. Richard felt his world stop. He cancelled everything. He rushed out of the office without explanation and drove at high speed to the clinic. When he arrived, he found his mother sitting on a gurney, her face pale and her arm immobilized. She was conscious, but her eyes were different. It wasn't just physical pain, it was something else, fear, confusion, and when she saw her son, she began to cry silently, something Richard had never seen in his life. Helen was not one for tears. She was resilient, and seeing her like this devastated him. Veronica was in the waiting room, seemingly distraught. She said she had just arrived, that the clinic had notified her just as they had him. She explained that his mother had been doing a balance exercise when she lost stability and fell. The professionals were already attending to her when Veronica arrived. Richard didn't question it. He simply thanked his wife for her presence and turned all his attention back to his mother. At the hospital, examinations confirmed a fracture of the humerus. Nothing life-threatening, but it would require a long period of recovery. Helen would spend days between pain medication and immobilization. Richard did not leave her side. He slept at the hospital, accompanied every shift change, every medical visit, every new result. And the more time he spent with his mother, the more he noticed something strange. Helen avoided talking about the accident. When he asked what had happened, she averted her gaze. She said she didn't remember clearly, that it had been quick, that everything was confused. But Richard knew his mother. He knew every expression, every silence. And that behavior was not confusion. It was fear. Veronica visited the hospital daily, always with flowers, always with words of support. But Richard began to notice something disturbing. Every time his wife entered the room, Helen became tense. Her body stiffened. Her responses became short, and she always found an excuse for Richard not to leave the room while Veronica was there. He found it strange, but tried to justify it. Perhaps his mother was fragile, sensitive, needing her son's presence more than ever. But then something happened that triggered the first real alarm. During one of the visits, Veronica was alone with Helen for a few minutes, while Richard took an urgent call in the corridor. When he returned to the room, he found his mother with wide eyes, trembling. Veronica was facing away, putting something in her bag. She said her mother-in-law had become a little agitated and that she was just trying to calm her down. Richard rushed to his mother, held her hand. Helen squeezed her son's hand with desperate force, as if clinging to a lifeline. And when Veronica left the room, his mother finally whispered something Richard would never forget. "She doesn't wish me well." Richard was paralyzed. He tried to understand. He asked what his mother meant, but Helen simply closed her eyes, too tired to continue, and Richard stood there beside her, that phrase echoing in his mind. She doesn't wish me well. What did that mean? Was it just the delusion of a woman weakened by pain and medication? Or was it something more? In the following days, Richard began to pay attention to details that had previously gone unnoticed. Veronica always asked about her mother-in-law's health, but there was something mechanical in those questions, as if they were part of a social script rather than genuine concern. She frequently mentioned that Helen was becoming frail, that perhaps it would be better to consider a definitive withdrawal from company activities, that the stress of signing documents could be detrimental to her recovery. Richard listened, but with growing unease, and then came the second disturbing revelation. Richard asked the clinic for a copy of the complete accident report. He wanted to understand exactly what had happened. The document included times, procedures, and names of the professionals present. But there was a strange gap. The security cameras in the physiotherapy room were turned off at the exact time of the fall. The technical justification was that there was scheduled system maintenance. Richard found that unbelievable. A clinic of that caliber, specializing in the elderly, turning off cameras precisely during a session. He asked to speak with the physiotherapist, who was with his mother at the time of the accident. The woman, visibly uncomfortable, said she was not the one in the room. It had been a last-minute substitution. The professional who should have been there had been released early, and another physiotherapist, newly hired, took over the session. Richard asked for the substitute's name. The clinic took days to provide the information, and when they finally did, Richard discovered that the professional no longer worked there. She had resigned shortly after the accident, without notice. All of this began to form a pattern Richard didn't want to believe, but which was becoming increasingly clear. He decided to act alone. Discreetly, he began to investigate. He hired a trusted lawyer, a man who had worked with the family for years and knew how to keep secrets. He requested access to internal clinic records, administrative transaction statements, and even security camera footage from the days leading up to the accident. He wanted to understand who had authorized the physiotherapist's substitution, who had ordered the cameras to be turned off, and why all of this had happened exactly on the day his mother was injured. The answers began to arrive, and each one was a stab. The physiotherapist's substitution had been requested by one of the clinic's administrative assistants, but this assistant had a direct connection to an outsourcing company that provided services to the foundation Veronica managed. The camera shutdown had been authorized by a technical order sent from a corporate email, but the IP address of the computer that sent that order was registered to a laptop Veronica frequently used, and the physiotherapist who resigned shortly after the accident had received a significant bank transfer days earlier from a corporate account linked to social projects managed by Richard's wife. Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be true. But the evidence was there, cold and relentless. Veronica had orchestrated something. She had manipulated circumstances, bought silence, and created conditions for something to happen to his mother. And the worst part? She had done all this while smiling, while bringing flowers to the hospital, while pretending to be the devoted daughter-in-law. Richard returned to the hospital room that night. Helen was already home, slowly recovering. He sat beside her bed, held his mother's hand, and finally asked the question he needed to ask. "Mother, tell me the truth. What happened that day?" Helen slowly opened her eyes. For a long moment she remained silent, and then, with a choked voice, she began to speak. "She was there, Richard. She was in the room when I fell. It wasn't an accident." Richard felt his heart pound. He asked his mother to continue, and what Helen recounted in the following minutes destroyed any illusion he still held about his marriage. Veronica was in the physiotherapy room observing. The physiotherapist, who should have been there, had left, leaving Helen alone for a few minutes. Veronica approached, began asking questions about company documents, about when her mother-in-law would finally sign over some corporate responsibilities. Helen, uncomfortable, tried to end the conversation. That's when she realized she was alone in the room with her daughter-in-law. The camera was off. There were no witnesses. Veronica changed her tone. She said that Helen was getting in the way, that she was too old to continue having power over family decisions, that it was past time for her to step away completely and leave control. in the hands of someone who truly understood the modern world. Helen tried to respond, but Veronica moved closer, with a look the elderly woman had never seen before. A cold look, calculating, dangerous. And then, just as Helen tried to move away, something happened. She lost her balance, tripped over the physiotherapy equipment, and fell. The pain was immediate and intense. She called for help, but Veronica didn't move. She stood there, still, watching her mother-in-law on the floor for long seconds before finally activating the emergency alarm. And when the team arrived, Veronica already had the perfect mask of concern on her face, saying she had just entered the room and found her mother-in-law like that. Richard listened in silence. Every word was like a blow. He knew his mother. He knew she didn't lie, and everything she said made sense with the evidence he had gathered. Veronica hadn't physically pushed his mother, but she had created the situation. She had intimidated. She had waited for the right moment, and when everything happened, she did nothing to prevent it. She wanted something to happen. She wanted Helen out of the way, and the worst part, all of this had a motive. Veronica wanted total control. She wanted to be the only voice that mattered, the only signature that counted, the only person with access to the family's assets and decisions. Helen was the last obstacle between her and complete dominion over the Alistair empire. Richard stayed by his mother's side until she fell asleep. Then he left the room and went to the living room. He sat on the sofa, alone in the dark, his mind in turmoil. He thought about everything he had built. He thought about his public image, the reputation he carried, the trust the world placed in him. And he thought about the woman with whom he shared his bed, the woman the world admired, the woman he believed to be his partner. It was all a lie. That night, Richard made a decision. He would not yell. He would not confront. He would not cause scandals. But he also would not leave it unanswered. Veronica had broken something that could never be repaired. Not his mother's arm, but trust, the foundation, respect. And Richard, who had always been a man of principles, knew that some things could not be forgiven. He returned home. In the early hours of the morning, Veronica was sleeping. The house was silent. Everything seemed normal, but nothing would ever be normal again. Because Richard Alistair, the man whom all of Britain respected, had just discovered he was living beside a stranger, and he was not the kind of man who left things unresolved. He just looked at his sleeping wife and whispered a single phrase to himself. "This won't stand." The following days were filled with calculated silence. Richard continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He woke up at the same time, had coffee with Veronica, talked about trivial matters, went to the office, returned home. But inside, something had irrevocably broken. Every word he exchanged with his wife was measured. Every gesture was observed. Every glance was analyzed. He had become a stranger in his own life, an actor playing the role of husband, while his mind worked in a completely different direction. Veronica noticed nothing. She continued smiling, talking about the foundation's projects, planning dinners and trips. For her, everything was under control. Her mother-in-law was recovering at home, away from corporate affairs. Her husband remained the exemplary businessman the entire country admired. And she continued to be the elegant and influential woman everyone envied. Nothing had changed, or at least that's what she believed. But Richard was just getting started. He knew he couldn't act on impulse. A man in his position couldn't afford a poorly planned scandal. He needed solid, irrefutable evidence that left no room for doubt. He needed to understand not only what Veronica had done, but why she had done it, and how far she was willing to go. And most importantly, he needed to ensure that when he finally acted, the response was so definitive that it could never be reversed. It was then that Richard contacted someone he had known since university. Frederick Carter was a lawyer specializing in corporate and patrimonial law, but he also had experience in confidential investigations. He was discreet, loyal, and above all understood that some battles needed to be fought away from the spotlight. Richard arranged a meeting at a cafe far from central London, away from familiar eyes. He got straight to the point. He told him everything: the accident, the suspicions, the preliminary evidence, and asked for help to go deeper. Frederick listened without interruption. When Richard finished, the lawyer remained silent for a few seconds, processing the information. Then he said something Richard would never forget. "If what you're telling me is true, Richard, your wife wasn't just trying to distance your mother. She was preparing the ground to take total control of the family's assets, and that means she must have already taken other steps that you haven't discovered yet." Those words fell like a bomb. Richard had never thought from that angle. He always imagined that Veronica just wanted more space, more freedom to make decisions without her mother-in-law's interference. But what if it went beyond that? What if she was planning something bigger, deeper, more devastating? Frederick suggested a complete investigation, not just about the accident, but about everything. Financial transactions, professional relationships, contracts signed in the foundation's name, bank accounts, properties, and even the social circles Veronica frequented. Richard authorized everything. No matter the cost, he needed the truth. The following weeks brought disturbing discoveries. Frederick hired a team of private investigators who began to scour every detail of Veronica Cross's life. And what they found was a frightening pattern of manipulation and control. The foundation she managed, which had an impeccable public reputation, was riddled with irregularities. Donations that came in but didn't appear in official reports, contracts signed with shell companies, transfers to personal accounts disguised as operational expenses. Veronica used her image as a philanthropist to divert resources and build a parallel fortune, completely hidden from Richard. But it didn't stop there. Investigators discovered that Veronica had opened bank accounts in the names of distant relatives, created front companies, and even acquired properties without Richard's knowledge. All of this using connections she had built over the years, favoring businessmen with public contracts through the foundation in exchange for personal financial benefits. It was a sophisticated scheme, well hidden but not perfect, and now Richard had access to every detail. Frederick organized everything into a voluminous dossier. There were bank statements, copies of contracts, screenshots of digital conversations, recordings of meetings, testimonies from former foundation employees, and even documents showing how Veronica had pressured people to get what she wanted. It was a labyrinth of lies, but every corridor led to the same conclusion. The woman Richard was married to had built a parallel life based on deceit, manipulation, and unchecked ambition. And there was something even more shocking. Frederick discovered that Veronica had in recent months been consulting lawyers specializing in divorce and asset division. She was studying ways to maximize what she could receive if the marriage ended. There were recorded conversations in which she discussed strategies to weaken Helen's influence over the family's assets, arguing that the elderly woman was no longer mentally capable of signing important documents. It was all planned. The accident had not been an isolated event. It was part of a larger plan. Richard read each page of the dossier with a mixture of shock, anger, and sadness. The woman he had chosen to share, his life with the woman he had presented to the world as his partner, was a stranger. Worse than a stranger, she was someone who had spent years pretending, calculating, waiting for the right moment to take what did not belong to her. But Richard was not a man of explosive reactions. He never was. He was a strategist. He knew that the best response was not the fastest, but the most definitive. And so he began to devise a plan. Not a plan of blind revenge, but of meticulous justice. He would dismantle piece by piece everything Veronica had built in the shadows, and he would do it in the same way she had done with his mother, in silence, discreetly, with the certainty that when everything came to light, there would be no turning back. The first step was to protect his mother. Richard hired a discreet security team to accompany Helen at all times. He justified it by saying it was for her recovery, but the real reason was to ensure nothing else happened to her. He also installed security cameras throughout his mother's home, something he should have done long ago. He no longer trusted anything. He no longer trusted anyone connected to Veronica. The second step was to begin shielding the assets. Richard asked Frederick to initiate a discreet process of reviewing all corporate documents and family contracts. He wanted to ensure that no suspicious movements could be made without his knowledge. He updated passwords, changed access, and created additional layers of security on all bank accounts and investments. Veronica could no longer do anything without him knowing. And then came the third and most delicate step, slowly beginning to undo Veronica's social connections. Richard knew that his wife's strength lay not only in the money she diverted or the schemes she devised. It lay in the public image she cultivated. Veronica was respected because everyone believed she was a woman of noble causes, someone who dedicated her time and resources to help the most vulnerable. But Richard now knew that all of that was a facade, and facades, when well attacked, collapse quickly. He started subtly. At dinners and social events, Richard began to make discreet comments about the need for audits in philanthropic institutions. He spoke of the importance of transparency, accountability, and seriousness in the use of donated resources. He didn't mention Veronica directly, but planted seeds of doubt. People began to pay attention. Some businessmen who donated to her foundation began to question the reports they received. Small cracks began to appear in the perfect image Veronica had built. In parallel, Frederick began to anonymously contact regulatory bodies and investigative journalists. He didn't deliver complete evidence yet, but left clues. A suspicious document here, a strange financial transaction there. Enough to pique curiosity, but not enough for Veronica to realize she was being investigated. And while all this was happening, Richard maintained the routine of an attentive husband. He dined with Veronica, listened to her stories about the foundation's projects, smiled when she talked about the events she was planning. But every gesture was rehearsed. Every word was strategic. He was just buying time. And Veronica, overly confident in her own intelligence, didn't realize that the ground was beginning to tremble beneath her feet. Then came the moment that changed everything. Richard was at home on a Saturday afternoon when he received a call from Frederick. The lawyer had discovered something new, something that went beyond diversion of resources or patrimonial manipulation. Months before the accident, Veronica had tried to alter Helen's will. She had consulted a different lawyer outside the family's circle of trust and asked for guidance on how to invalidate testamentary clauses based on allegations of the testator's mental incapacity. She wanted to prove that Helen was not in a condition to make decisions and, with that, transfer all patrimonial control into Richard's hands. And once Richard was officially the sole legal guardian, it would be much easier for Veronica, as his wife, to have unrestricted access to everything. It was a long-term plan, sophisticated, cruel, and it was almost working. Richard hung up the phone and stood, still for long minutes. The house was silent. Veronica had gone out to a charity event, and there, alone, he finally allowed the anger to surface. Not an explosive anger, but a cold, controlled, definitive rage. Veronica had not just hurt his mother. She had planned to destroy the very essence of the Alistair family. She had planned to erase the matriarch's voice, take control of everything, and leave Helen as a decorative and powerless figure. At that moment, Richard made the final decision. There would be no forgiveness, there would be no conversation, there would be no second chance. Veronica would be removed from his life in the same way she tried to remove Helen, systematically, calculatedly, and irreversibly. In the following days, Richard met with Frederick and began preparing the definitive attack. The divorce would be contested, based on bad faith, attempted patrimonial fraud, and assault on the physical and psychological integrity of a family member. All evidence would be presented. All diversions would be exposed. And there would be no room for negotiation. But before the divorce, Richard wanted to ensure that Veronica lost something even more valuable to her than money: her public image. Frederick arranged a confidential meeting with editors from 3 of the country's leading publications. He didn't officially hand over anything, but made it clear that there was an explosive story involving one of the most respected figures in British philanthropy. The journalists, experienced enough to recognize a big story, began their own investigations. And when they cross-referenced the information they had with the clues Frederick had left, the puzzle began to form. In parallel, Richard contacted his connections in the corporate world. He began to subtly suggest that companies and investors re-evaluate their partnerships with Veronica's foundation. He made no direct accusations, merely raised questions about transparency and governance. But that was enough for some sponsors to begin to withdraw. And then, on an August morning, the first article was published. It was a detailed investigative article about irregularities in British social foundations. Veronica was not the only one mentioned, but she was there, her name associated with diversions, suspicious contracts, and a lack of accountability. The article was careful enough not to make direct accusations that could result in lawsuits, but forceful enough to plant doubts in anyone who read it. Veronica was furious. She called lawyers, demanded a right of reply, threatened to sue the newspaper, but Richard merely observed. He didn't comment. He didn't offer an opinion. He simply said she should act as she saw fit. And while Veronica struggled to put out that fire, another one was already starting elsewhere. A second publication brought to light testimonies from former foundation employees, people who had been fired when they questioned internal procedures, people who had been afraid to speak, but who now, with the first article published, felt encouraged to tell their versions. And each testimony added another layer of credibility to the accusations. Veronica's image began to crack. Social media, which had always celebrated her as an example of a successful and engaged woman, began to question. Critical comments appeared on every post. Brands began to remove photos in which she appeared. Events cancelled invitations. Boards of directors requested her temporary removal until the accusations were clarified. And all of this happened in a matter of weeks. Veronica tried to talk to Richard. She said she was being wronged, that it was all a setup, that envious people were trying to destroy her. Richard listened in silence. He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He simply said he believed in justice, and that if she had nothing to fear, the truth would prevail. But inside, he knew exactly what he was doing. Every piece was moving as planned. And then came the definitive blow. Frederick filed for divorce. It was not a consensual, simple, discreet divorce. It was a contested divorce, with an initial petition of over 100 pages, accompanied by voluminous annexes containing all the evidence that had been gathered. Accusations of matrimonial bad faith, attempted patrimonial fraud, manipulation of documents, and psychological and physical injury to a family member. The document requested the annulment of any clause that benefited Veronica in case of separation, alleging that the marriage had been built on false pretenses from the start. When Veronica received the notification, she was in shock. She tried to call Richard, but he didn't answer. She tried to go to his office, but security wouldn't let her in. She tried to find him at home, but discovered that he had moved to a corporate apartment weeks earlier, something she hadn't even noticed amidst the chaos forming around her. She was alone. The lawyers she hired looked at the process and were speechless. The evidence was solid, well documented, and practically impossible to refute. Veronica tried to claim it was all a setup, but the documents themselves bore her signature, her fingerprints, her records. There was no denying it. And as the divorce proceedings advanced in the courts, Veronica's social destruction was completed. More articles were published. Regulatory bodies opened official investigations into the foundation. Donors demanded a full audit. Former employees began to sue for workplace bullying. Business partners broke contracts. And society, which once applauded her, now condemned her. Richard, meanwhile, remained silent. He gave no interviews. He made no public statements. He simply went about his life, focused on business, visiting his mother daily, rebuilding the peace Veronica had destroyed. And whenever anyone asked about the divorce, he responded with a short, powerful phrase. Justice is being served. And it was. Slow, methodical, irreversible. Veronica Cross, the woman who was once a magazine cover star, an icon of philanthropy, and an example of success, was being erased from London's social map. Her name was no longer synonymous with admiration. It was synonymous with fraud. And the man responsible for that downfall never raised his voice, never caused a scandal. He simply allowed the truth to do the work, Because for Richard Alastair, revenge didn't need to be noisy, it needed to be just. And justice, when well executed, is silent but devastating. Autumn arrived in London, bringing with it a change few expected. The city, always bustling and indifferent to personal tragedies, seemed finally to pay attention to a story that touched something deep in the collective imagination, the fall of someone who seemed untouchable. Veronica Cross, the woman who for years graced magazine covers and charity event platforms, was now the subject of whispered conversations in restaurants, news programs, and social media discussions. And everything collapsed with frightening speed. The foundation she managed was officially investigated by regulatory bodies. Independent auditors were called in and, within days, confirmed what the initial journalistic reports had suggested. There were serious irregularities. Donations that did not appear in reports, overpriced contracts, shell companies providing non-existent services, funds diverted to personal accounts. Everything was documented, recorded, impossible to deny. The Foundation's Board of Trustees called an emergency meeting. Veronica was notified to attend, but when she arrived at the building where the headquarters were located, she realized something was different. People who used to greet her with smiles now averted their gaze. The receptionist, who was usually friendly, maintained a professional and distant tone, and when she finally entered the meeting room, she found closed faces, serious expressions, an awkward silence. The chairman of the board went straight to the point. He presented the preliminary audit results. He showed documents, statements, evidence. And then, with icy formality, he communicated the decision. Veronica Cross was removed from all administrative functions of the foundation, with immediate effect. A new board would be appointed, legal proceedings would be opened, and her name would be removed from all official communications. Veronica tried to defend herself. She said there were misunderstandings, that she was a victim of persecution, that envious people were trying to destroy her work. But the board members just listened in silence. There was no room for arguments. The evidence was too overwhelming. When she finished speaking, the chairman simply asked her to leave. There was no farewell, no thanks for years of work, just a cold request for her to vacate the premises. Veronica left that meeting with trembling legs. For the first time in many years, she felt real fear. It wasn't just the loss of the foundation. It was the realization that everything was collapsing at once. The divorce was progressing in the courts. The press continued to publish negative stories. Social media crucified her daily. And now, the very institution she had built publicly repudiated her. She tried to contact her connections. She called businessmen who had always supported her, politicians who frequented her events, friends who were part of the same social circle. But the answers were always the same: polite excuses, sudden commitments, vague promises to talk another time. No one wanted to be seen with her. No one wanted to risk their own reputation by associating with someone who was being publicly exposed. Veronica gradually realized that she was completely alone. The lawyers she hired to defend her in the divorce began to show signs of discomfort. The case was complex, the evidence against her was overwhelming, and Richard had put together an impeccable legal strategy. There were no loopholes, there was no room for negotiation. Every attempt at defense was immediately countered with documents, testimonies, and evidence that made any argument from Veronica unsustainable. And then came the hardest blow: the asset freeze. The judge presiding over the case reviewed Richard's allegations and decided by interim order to freeze all assets in Veronica's name or acquired during the marriage. Bank accounts were frozen, credit cards were cancelled. The apartment where she lived, which was registered in her name but had been paid for with couples' funds, was included in the schedule of assets to be divided. She had until the end of the month to vacate the property. Veronica tried to contest the decision, but her lawyers were clear. There was nothing to be done. The evidence presented by Richard demonstrated that she had attempted to illicitly manipulate the family's assets. The asset freeze was a protective measure to ensure nothing was diverted during the process, and considering the gravity of the accusations, any judge would make the same decision. For the first time, Veronica understood the dimension of what was happening. It wasn't just a divorce. It was the complete destruction of everything she had built. Her public image was ruined. Her assets were frozen. Her social connections had disappeared. And the man she had underestimated, the man she believed she controlled, had been the architect of her entire downfall. In desperation, she tried to find Richard. She sent messages, called countless times, even went to his office. But Richard never responded, never answered, never gave her the chance for a conversation. And that silence was more devastating than any confrontation could be, because it showed that, for him, she no longer existed. She wasn't even worth the energy of an argument. Weeks passed, and Veronica's situation only worsened. She had to move to a small apartment, rented with the little money she still had in an account that hadn't been frozen. It was a brutal contrast to the luxurious life she had led. She no longer had a chauffeur, no longer had staff, no longer had events to attend. She spent her days locked away, avoiding going out to escape judgmental stares or malicious comments. And then the interviews began. Television programs and news portals wanted to hear her side. Veronica, believing she would finally have a chance to defend herself, agreed to give a few interviews. It was a devastating mistake. In the first interview, she tried to portray herself as a victim. She said she was being persecuted, that her ex-husband had orchestrated a defamation campaign, that the accusations were unfounded. She spoke with tears in her eyes, with a choked voice, trying to evoke public sympathy. But the strategy didn't work. Minutes after the interview aired, social media exploded with criticism. People began sharing documents and evidence that had been released by the press. Former Foundation employees appeared on live programs to contradict Veronica's versions, and journalists published stories debunking every argument she had presented. The second interview was even worse. Veronica, desperate, tried to change her strategy. She admitted that she had made mistakes but tried to minimize them. She said everyone did it, that the corporate world was like that she had merely followed common market practices. But that defense sounded like a confession, and the public, already outraged, became even more indignant. How could she admit to diversions and still try to justify herself? After that, no program wanted to interview her anymore. And Veronica understood that she had lost not only the legal battle, she had lost the battle of public opinion. And in the society she lived in, where image was worth as much as any asset, that was a definitive sentence. Meanwhile, Richard continued his life in a completely opposite way. He gave no interviews. He made no statements. He did not use social media to attack or defend himself. He simply continued his usual routine, running his businesses, attending meetings, making donations to legitimate social causes. And whenever asked about the divorce, he responded with a short, polite phrase, "It's a matter being resolved by the courts." That stance of silence and dignity only increased the respect people had for him. Society saw Richard as a man who had been betrayed, deceived, but who did not stoop to the level of gossip or scandals. He let the truth speak for itself. And the truth, in this case, was devastating for Veronica. Helen, for her part, was recovering well. Her fractured arm had healed and she was slowly returning to normal activities. Richard visited his mother every day, and those encounters were a moment of peace amidst all the chaos. Helen never asked about Veronica. She never mentioned the divorce. She simply thanked her son silently for having done what needed to be done. On one of these visits, Helen held Richard's hand and said something he would carry forever. "You protected our family, and that's all that matters." Richard simply nodded. He needed nothing more. His mother's approval, the certainty that he had done the right thing, was all he needed to move forward. And then, on an October morning, something happened that would mark the beginning of a new phase in Richard's life. He was at a corporate event, one of those networking lunches that are part of any successful businessman's routine. The atmosphere was elegant. Conversations were about business and opportunities, and Richard participated cordially, but without great enthusiasm. His mind was still processing everything that had happened in recent months. That's when someone approached the table where he was sitting. She was a woman of simple appearance, but with a serene gaze that drew attention. She wore discreet clothes without ostentation and had an honest smile without artificiality. She introduced herself as Marina Olsen, coordinator of an NGO that cared for vulnerable elderly people. She had been invited to the event because the organization she managed was being recognized for its serious and transparent work. Marina didn't know who Richard was, or at least she didn't show it. She simply sat at the table, spoke naturally about the work she developed, talked passionately about the elderly people she served, about the difficulties of keeping the NGO running without major sponsors, but with much love and dedication. She didn't ask for donations. She didn't try to impress. She simply shared her story. Richard was fascinated, not by the story itself, but by the way she spoke. There was a sincerity there that he hadn't seen in a long time. Marina wasn't trying to sell an image. She wasn't performing for an audience. She was genuine. And that, for Richard, was like a breath of fresh air amidst a world where everything seemed false. They talked for almost an hour. Marina spoke about the challenges of caring for people who had been abandoned by their own families, about how difficult it was to see elderly people suffering from loneliness, about how much a simple gesture of affection could transform someone's life. And Richard, for the first time in months, felt something different. It wasn't just interest or curiosity, it was connection. When the event ended, Richard asked for Marina's contact information. He said he would like to learn about the NGO's work, perhaps visit, better understand how he could help. Marina accepted without ulterior motives, without games, just an honest openness for anyone who wanted to contribute to an important cause. In the following days, Richard visited the NGO's headquarters. It was a modest space in a neighborhood far from central London, but organized and clean. There were elderly people sitting in chairs, some watching television, others talking among themselves, some just resting. And Marina was there, caring for each one with an attention that seemed genuine. Richard observed everything in silence. He saw how she treated those people with respect, with affection, with dignity. There were no cameras, no press, no one to record that work. It was just Marina and her small team, doing what needed to be done because they believed it was right. And at that moment, Richard understood something fundamental. He had spent years alongside someone who faked kindness, who used social causes as a tool for self-promotion, who transformed compassion into opportunity. And now he was before someone who lived it for real. They began to meet more frequently. They weren't romantic dates. They were conversations, simple lunches, visits to the NGO. Marina never asked about the divorce. She never showed interest in Richard's money or position. She simply treated him as an ordinary person, someone who, like anyone else, deserved to be heard and respected. And gradually Richard began to open up. He spoke about his mother, about the betrayal he had experienced, about the disillusionment of discovering that everything he believed was a lie. Marina simply listened. She didn't judge. She didn't offer easy solutions. She was just present. And that presence, simple and honest, began to heal something in Richard that he didn't even know was wounded. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings came to an end. The judge analyzed all the evidence presented, heard witnesses, evaluated the arguments of both parties, and issued the judgment. Divorce was granted on the terms requested by Richard. Veronica would not be entitled to any part of the family assets. All assets acquired during the marriage were declared to be the result of bad faith and fraud, and therefore not subject to division. Furthermore, Veronica was ordered to return funds she had diverted from the foundation under penalty of criminal prosecution for embezzlement. The judgment was published and quickly spread through the press. It was the final chapter of a story that had shocked London society. Veronica Cross, once a symbol of success and philanthropy, was now officially recognized by the courts as a person who had acted in bad faith, deceived her husband, manipulated institutions, and attempted to harm an elderly woman to gain personal advantages. Veronica read the judgment alone, in her small, empty apartment. There was no one to console her. There were no lawyers to appeal. There were no friends to support her. She was completely isolated, and for the first time she understood what she had lost. It wasn't just the money or the social position. It was the possibility of being someone, of having value, of being respected. She had built an entire life based on appearances, and when the appearances crumbled, she discovered there was nothing behind them, no true relationships, no real achievements, no legacy worth having. And the most painful thing was knowing that all of it was a consequence of her own choices. She couldn't blame anyone. She couldn't play the victim, because everyone knew the truth. And the truth was that she had tried to destroy someone to gain power, and in the end, it was she who was destroyed. Richard, meanwhile, felt a strange peace when he received news of the judgment. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't satisfied revenge. It was simply the closing of a cycle. He had done what needed to be done. He protected his mother. He preserved the family's legacy. And now he could move forward. And moving forward, for him, meant something he hadn't expected, a new beginning. Not just in business or social life, but emotionally. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it was possible. Because now there was someone by his side who showed him that not everything was false, that there were still good people, that it was still possible to trust. Summer arrived. In London with its characteristic warmth, but for Richard Allister, the season brought something more than just a change in weather. It brought a sense of renewal he hadn't felt in a long time. The past 6 months had been intense, painful, transformative. But now, for the first time since everything began, he could breathe without the weight of the past suffocating his every move. The divorce was finalized. Veronica had completely exited his life. The court judgment had been clear and definitive, with no room for appeals or new attempts at reversal. His assets were protected, his family was safe, and the truth had been irrefutably established. There was nothing left to do, it was time to look forward. And looking forward for Richard meant looking at Marina. In the months following the judgment, their relationship evolved naturally and honestly. There was no rush, there was no pressure, just a mutual understanding that something special was happening. Marina continued her work at the NGO, caring for the elderly with the same dedication as always, and Richard began to get more actively involved with the cause, not just with financial donations but with his presence. He visited the institution regularly, talked to the elderly, learned their stories, understood their pains. And the more time he spent there, the more he understood what had been missing from his life in recent years. Authenticity. Marina was everything Veronica pretended to be. She didn't need the spotlight to validate her work. She didn't need public recognition to feel fulfilled. She did what she did because she believed it was right, because she knew those people needed care and dignity. And she saw in every smile she managed to elicit from a lonely elder the proof that her work was worthwhile. Richard admired that, deeply. And gradually that admiration transformed into something deeper. It wasn't just respect or gratitude, it was love. A different kind of love than he had felt before. A love based on truth, on real compatibility, on shared values. And Marina felt the same. She had noticed from the first day that Richard was different, not because of his position or his money, but because of the way he treated people. There was a kindness in him, a generosity that went beyond public gestures. He listened, he respected, and above all, he valued what truly mattered, genuine human relationships. They officially started dating in early December. They didn't make any public announcement. They didn't post photos on social media. They simply allowed the people around them to notice naturally. And when they finally made their relationship known to their close circles, the reaction was unanimous approval. Richard's friends, who had witnessed all the suffering he had endured, were genuinely happy to see him with someone who clearly made him well. And Helen, who met Marina during a visit Richard specially arranged, approved immediately. The meeting between the two was simple but significant. Marina arrived at Helen's house without pretensions, without trying to impress. She simply introduced herself with politeness and humility, and Helen, who had learned to read people over decades of life, immediately realized that this woman was special. There was no falsehood, there was no calculation, just sincerity. The two talked for hours. Marina spoke about her work, about the challenges of caring for abandoned elderly people, about how she saw in each of them a life story that deserved to be respected. And Helen, moved, shared her own experiences, spoke about the loneliness many elderly people face, about how important it is to have someone who truly cares. When Marina left that visit, Helen looked at her son and said just one sentence: "This one truly is a woman of substance." Richard smiled. He needed nothing more. His mother's approval was confirmation that he had made the right choice. Meanwhile, Veronica's life moved in the opposite direction. She had tried to rebuild something, but every attempt was frustrated. She tried to open a new consulting firm, but no one wanted to hire her services. She tried to reconnect with old contacts, but everyone kept their distance. She even tried to create a new profile on social media, to reinvent herself. But the internet has a long memory, and someone quickly discovered and exposed who she really was. Veronica now lived in a modest apartment, supported by an administrative job in a small company that asked no questions about her past. She no longer had a chauffeur, no longer had designer clothes, no longer had events to attend. She spent her days in silence, reflecting on how everything had collapsed so quickly. And the worst part wasn't the material loss. It was the awareness that she had been the architect of her own downfall. She had everything. A respected husband, an enviable social position, a comfortable life. But it wasn't enough. She wanted more. She wanted total control, and in the pursuit of absolute power, she lost everything. Sometimes late at night when she was alone, Veronica found herself thinking about how things could have been different if she had treated Helen with respect, if she had valued her marriage, if she had been honest. But these were just empty thoughts, because the reality was irreversible. She had made her choices, and now she lived with the consequences. But the story wasn't about Veronica. It never was. It was about justice, about protection, about new beginnings. And Richard's new beginning was just starting. In February of the following year, Richard was invited to be a speaker at one of the country's largest entrepreneurship and social responsibility events, which would take place in London. The theme was integrity in business and the role of companies in building a fairer society. It was a prestigious invitation, and Richard accepted. But there was something different about that lecture. He wouldn't go alone. Richard asked the event organizers to include Marina in the program, not as an escort, but as a speaker, alongside him. He wanted to introduce her to the world not as businessman Richard Allister's new partner, but as Marina Olsen, coordinator of an NGO that made a real difference in the lives of vulnerable people. The organization readily accepted, and when the day of the event arrived, the auditorium was packed. Businessmen, journalists, influencers, academics, all curious to see Richard Allister, the man who had gone through one of the most talked-about divorces of the year, and who was now reappearing in public. When Richard took the stage, he was greeted with respectful applause. He thanked the audience, greeted them, and began his speech. He spoke about the importance of integrity, about how to build sustainable businesses not just financially, but morally. He spoke about the responsibility of those with resources to use those resources to generate positive impact. But he didn't talk about the divorce. He didn't talk about Veronica. He didn't use the stage to promote himself or to attack. And then, in the middle of the lecture, Richard did something no one expected. He paused, looked at the audience and said, "But I didn't come here today to talk only about my experiences. I came to introduce someone who taught me in recent months what true social work is." And he invited Marina to the stage. There was a murmur in the auditorium. People exchanged glances, curious. Who was that woman? The journalists present immediately began taking notes, researching, speculating. But when Marina took the stage, all speculation dissipated. She was simple, as always, without ostentation, without artifice. And when she began to speak, her voice was calm, honest, direct. Marina talked about the NGO. She spoke of the elderly people she cared for, of the stories of abandonment she heard every day, of the difficulties of maintaining serious work without major sponsors. But she didn't ask for donations. She didn't make dramatic pleas. She simply shared the reality. And that reality, spoken so sincerely, touched everyone who was listening. She explained that many elderly people who arrived at the NGO had been abandoned by their own families, some because they lacked resources, others because they became a burden, and that the institution's work was to give these people something simple but essential: dignity. "It's not about luxury," Marina said. "It's about respect. It's about looking someone in the eye and saying, 'You matter.'" The auditorium fell silent. It was rare to hear something so genuine at events of that type, where speeches were often rehearsed, calculated, designed to impress. But Marina wasn't trying to impress. She was just being herself. When she finished, the applause was long and warm, and Richard by her side felt a pride he had never felt before. It wasn't pride of possession. It was pride in being alongside someone who represented what he had always believed to be right. After the lecture, dozens of people approached Marina. Businessmen wanted to know how they could help. Journalists asked for interviews. Universities offered partnerships. And all of this happened not because she was Richard Alastair's partner, but because her work was real, genuine, necessary. Richard supported everything, but always behind the scenes. He didn't want the NGO to be seen as businessman Richard Alastair's project. He wanted it to be recognized as Marina Olsen's work, and he was proud of that. Helen, fully recovered, returned to participate in the company's strategic meetings, but now with a different lightness. She no longer had to worry about betrayals or manipulations. The family was protected, the legacy was secure, and her son, finally, was happy. On a Sunday afternoon, Richard was at his mother's house with Marina. The three were in the garden having a quiet coffee, talking about future plans, and at one point, Helen looked at Marina and said something that would stay with him forever. "Thank you for taking care of my son, not just now but always." Marina held the elderly woman's hand and replied simply, "And thank you for raising a man who knows the value of the right things." Helen smiled, and Richard, watching that scene, felt that everything finally made sense. All the pains, all the challenges, all the painful discoveries had led to that moment, and it was worth it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Veronica looked out the window of her small apartment. She had read about the event. She had seen photos of Richard alongside Marina on news websites, and for the first time, she fully understood what she had lost. Not the money, not the social position, but the chance to have something real. She felt no anger. She felt no envy. Just a deep emptiness, because she realized that throughout all those years she had fought for the wrong things. She had sought power when she should have sought connection. She had chosen appearances when she should have chosen truth. And now, alone and isolated, she understood that the greatest punishment was not what she had lost. It was having to live knowing that everything could have been different if she had made different choices. But it was too late. The seasons continued to change, and with them, Richard's life was rebuilt in a solid and genuine way. He and Marina got engaged in an intimate ceremony with only close friends and family. No pomp, no headlines. Just true. Love celebrated in the simplest way possible. Helen, her health completely restored, cried with emotion seeing her son finally find the happiness he deserved. And when Marina knelt before the elderly woman, in a spontaneous gesture of respect, and asked for her blessing, Helen held the young woman's face with both hands and said, "You already have my blessing, and you have my eternal gratitude." It was a simple moment, but full of meaning, because it represented not only the union of two people, but the healing of a family that had been attacked and was now whole again. And so the story that began with pain and betrayal ended with redemption and a new beginning. Richard Alastair had learned lessons that no business school could teach. He learned that integrity is not just a pretty word in corporate speeches, but a daily choice. He learned that not all that glitters is gold, and that the most valuable people are not always the most visible. He learned that protecting those you love is more important than preserving appearances. And he learned that justice, when well executed, doesn't need shouts or scandals. Just truth, Veronica also learned. But her lessons came too late. She learned that manipulation always has an expiration date, that masks eventually fall, that fame built on lies crumbles at the first breath of truth. And that loneliness is not just being physically alone, but being surrounded by people who don't truly care. The difference between the two was simple. Richard chose to build something real. Veronica chose to build something false. And in the end, only what is real remains. Years later, when asked about that difficult period of his life, Richard always answered the same way. That's when I learned the difference between seeming to be and truly being. And when asked about Marina, he smiled and said, "She showed me that good people still exist, and that it's worth believing in that." The story of Richard, Helen, Marina, and Veronica became, in a way, a tale about choices, about how every decision we make builds the path we will travel, about how integrity, in the end, always wins, and about how true wealth is not in bank accounts or social positions, but in the genuine relationships we build. And so, under the London sky, life went on. Richard and Marina built a future based on truth and love. Helen lived her days with the peace of one who saw justice served, and Veronica learned day after day that some lessons can only be taught by the pain of one's own choices. What she broke was an elderly woman's arm. What Richard broke was the mask of a lie. And in the end, each reaped exactly what they sowed. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Richard, Helen, and Marina has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of overcoming, justice, and new beginnings, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what moment stood out most to you. Every day we bring intense and transformative stories like this, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul, showing that truth always prevails and that it's never too late to start anew with dignity. Your presence here makes all the difference. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on life.